Crysis Warhead is the expansion pack to Crysis. It was released a year after the original game and follows the events of Psycho, a member of the Raptor team featured in the original game, with the new campaign taking place around the same time that Nomad and Prophet were attacked by the Ceph and the whole island turned into a war zone. It was released in 2008 exclusively for Microsoft Windows. Now, the expansion's big claim to fame at the time was that it was supposed to have improved performance over the original game, which was a bit of a resource hog for computers at the time. Aside from the so-called improved performance, Crysis Warhead also offered up a much more refined and tightly crafted campaign, albeit one that's a lot shorter. Despite not improving things all that much, it still does kind of stand the test of time in a lot of ways, mainly the approach it allows players to take in completing their objectives. It's a bit of a relic in the sense that it offers a truly opened up world, throwing the player in the middle of this large-scale conflict. So if you still have the desire to kill droves of brain-dead Korean soldiers and lots of aliens, well then Crysis Warhead will definitely satisfy. So let's take a look at it, shall we? So for all intents and purposes, Crysis Warhead is pretty much the exact same across the board as the first game, just with an entirely new campaign and a couple of new weapons. Playing as Psycho controls the exact same as Nomad. You're again in control of the awesome nanosuit, which gives you access to increased strength, speed, armor, and a cloaking device that runs out quicker than Monster Energy drinks at a 14-year-old sleepover. Psycho is just a much more enjoyable protagonist to play as, even if he sounds like he's ripped straight out of a Guy Ritchie film.
I'm a POW, you bastard!
The cinematics are sadly kind of dull and feel like they've had bugger all effort put into them, but it's still good seeing things from an alternate perspective, and the way the events in the campaign tie in with the original game is pretty well handled. It's this somewhat believable story about the Americans and the North Koreans fighting for dominance over this alien technology that's ultimately too powerful for either of them to control. It's just that a few characters are poorly written and a bit cheesy, which kind of lets it all down. The main antagonist is a guy named Lee Kim, and about all this dude is missing is a moustache to twirl. He really does come off as being that ham-fisted. Now, in terms of the gameplay, Crysis Warhead is as hard or as easy as you want to make it. If you just run around without using any of the suit's abilities, shooting at everyone on sight, then you're going to get your ass kicked. Enemies are brain dead, but they're still very accurate with weapons. I mean, these guys have trouble navigating through doorways, but have no issues in taking you out with perfect accuracy with a mounted machine gun from several hundred meters away. And I'd say that this is the biggest issue with the game, only because it highlights just how artificial the enemies are and makes them seem less realistic. But getting to that point where you're unlucky enough to have someone sniping at you with a 50 cal is kind of your own fault to begin with. If you're playing sensibly, chances are you can most often avoid it coming to this, or at least lessen the frustration you get from it. Learning the shortcuts for swapping back and forth between the suit's various modes is kind of a necessity, though I never really found a practical use for the increased strength. Using the suit's armor mode basically just means the suit will drain your energy first before it drains your health, which on the highest difficulty makes the difference between dying in 2 seconds to dying in 3 or 4. And the suit's speed mode is mostly useful when you're trying to get to your next objective, as Psycho's default movement speed is painfully slow. Cloak, I think, is really the most objectively useful ability that the suit has, often allowing you to avoid enemies entirely. And as they say, the Sonny Jim who runs away lives to fight another day. Being surrounded by a jungle, you've got to use the environment to your advantage, popping in and out of the cloak mode to flank your enemies and ultimately overcome everything the game throws at you. Now, I think this is something that both Warhead and the first Crysis game do undeniably well, and it's what I think is the game's biggest strength. You're not ever really under any sort of time constraint outside of a few key areas and some segments on rails, but the game never really forces your hand in any way. As I said before, it's a matter of just dropping the player into this large, detailed, vibrant game world that honestly feels pretty damn believable, giving you all the tools you need, but letting you forge your own path. If you're trying to approach an enemy base and the front door's guarded by a couple of guys sitting on an MG nest, then circle around and chances are there's a hole in the fence or some other way you can still get in. Again, like the prior game, I found that difficulty modes to be unbalanced in the sense that playing on the highest difficulty makes it seem like your nanosuit is made out of tissue paper, and if enemies even fire their weapons in your general direction, it seems like you're on death's door almost instantly. You should really be playing both these games on hard, if not the highest difficulty mode though, as the game's far too forgiving otherwise. And you're more likely to enjoy the combat a lot more if you use your head and don't go running into gunfights like an idiot. There's plenty of weapons you've got at your disposal as well, from pistols, assault rifles, and rocket launchers. New weapons include a smaller version of the submachine gun, which can also be dual-wielded, and a grenade launcher which isn't all that useful due to its firing style. I mean, they're not exactly earth-shattering new weapons, but the original weapon lineup was already pretty solid, and they're just giving the shooting a few more options more than anything else. I think an element of Crysis that's always been really enjoyable is the way that you can take all these weapons and mod them in a number of ways, from adding flashlights or laser pointers to reflex sights or sniper scopes. Everyone who plays the game is going to have their own personal preference and combination that works best for them. I mean, for me it's the Gauss rifle with the assault scope combined with a shotgun or submachine gun to fall back on. And much like the first game, Warhead excels at just putting you into these large opened up environments and letting you do things however the hell you want to. You know, like taking out enemies from a distance with a sniper rifle or heading into close range and ambushing them with a shotgun. There's a couple levels that put you into drivable vehicles, and one of the later levels in the game also puts you on rails quite literally as you're on the back of a train taking out the Ceph and Koreans alike. I think one of the better missions is one where you're moving through these dark caves, and not only does this show off a level of suspense and tension that we don't really get for the remainder of the game, but it's also still got some absolutely phenomenal looking dynamic lighting. Now, there's only 7 levels in the entire game, but they're all absolutely gigantic and could take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes to complete each, depending on how long you take and whether or not you stop to take in all the scenery. The whole thing could take you 5 or 6 hours to finish, or it could take you 15 or 20 hours. It's entirely up to the pace the player wants to set. Overall though, there's definitely a sense of Crysis Warhead having a much faster pace than the first game, and pretty much from the get-go you're thrown into plenty of cool combat situations. Speaking of scenery, I guess it goes without saying, but yeah, Crysis Warhead is still a damn good looking game, even 8 years after its original release. It's a shame that Warhead doesn't really throw any new environments into the mix, and everything on offer is pretty much just rehashed from the last game, not that this is really a bad thing. I still think the standouts are the levels where everything's been frozen by the Ceph, which just shows off some incredibly sharp and detailed texture work, and I'd say there's some of the most gorgeous looking environments in any single video game, like, ever. The various weather and atmospheric effects are just incredible to witness, and when you're standing on some kind of lookout, taking in a panoramic view of your surroundings, it just makes for incredible eye candy. It's kind of sad in a way that this game I think genuinely does hold up against anything released in the current year. Even the attention to detail blows current gen games out of the water, like looking down your weapon scope during some of the frozen levels for instance, and the scope being covered in convincing looking frost. This is actually the first game I used to benchmark my new GTX 1080, and I was still shocked that the game dipped under 60 frames per second at a few key points, even down to 30 frames per second at one point in particular, which I think just shows off how incredibly demanding and also unoptimized the CryEngine is. As I said earlier, Crytek claimed the engine had been updated for improved performance, but even at the time, I don't remember it being all that much better off. It's still an absolute system hog, but it's much more playable at the high or ultra settings. Just don't expect it to keep its perfect frame rate the entire playthrough. So I guess the only complaints I have about Crysis Warhead again kind of harks back to things I had problems with in Crysis 1. The game doesn't really seem to be designed with the higher difficulties in mind, because there's sections in the game that all but force you into combat. And on anything but the default difficulty, your health and suit's energy just kind of melts off when you're taking damage. It just feels really unbalanced, and whilst it might be fine most of the time, it's just when they put you into these forced combat sections it really shows its flaws. I really wish the difficulty modes affected the enemy AI, which it does to a point, but all it really does mostly affect, as I said, is the amount of damage you can take. The best thing about the highest difficulty is that the enemies speak Korean and not English. When you're playing on the default difficulty, they often shout out to each other what they're going to be doing next. You know, if they're going to be flanking and all that kind of stuff. But when they're speaking in Korean, unless you actually understand the language, well, you've got no idea what their plans are. It also makes sense for them to be speaking in their native tongue. So honestly, I think this should just be on by default, but that's really just me nitpicking. There's also again lots of little weird bugs with the physics, like vehicles suddenly flipping out or doing 180s when you run over a small rock as an example. And in case I already didn't mention it, the AI really is often stupid as shit. But Crysis Warhead is still pretty fun to play overall. I mean, I've never been a big fan of these games, but I do think that Warhead is one of the better games in the series. If only for the new weapons and items and the fact that it does seem to flow a lot better than the prior game. When Crysis Warhead came out was that year that open world FPS games were really starting to get into stride. Far Cry 2, the Stalker series, Wolfenstein and Borderlands all came out around that same time period, and I think the fact that Warhead had the nanosuit's abilities meant it ultimately had the edge in the sense of options it would give the player for messing around with. It's kind of sad that the ensuing Crysis games kind of got lost up their own asses, exploring the origins of the Ceph and introducing all these corrupt corporations and military groups that made things way too convoluted. And there's just something kind of simple about the first two games, with it just being a story about a bunch of soldiers stuck on an island fighting aliens. I've never really been the biggest fan of these games, only for the sole reason that I think they're almost too expansive to the point that they often seem less refined, but in terms of games that drop you into a sandbox, Crysis and Crysis Warhead are about as good as it gets. To deny their influence on the industry is like denying the influence games like Doom, Quake and Half-Life had. Crysis Warhead is also an example of a bygone era where expansion packs lived up to the games they were based on. And even if you played and it's not your cup of tea, well at least it's still a great benchmarking tool for when you've built that new PC.